In 1991, millions of Americans laughed hysterically when Peggy Bundy paraded her pregnant belly on television. But that wasn't a fake TV bump. It was real. Actress Katey Sagal was expecting her first child. But at 7 months, tragedy struck. Her baby was stillborn. A mother's heart was shattered. But the Fox network had a comedy show to run. They made a blood-chilling decision, erasing her dead child from existence by calling the entire pregnancy Al Bundy's nightmare. While the husband who hated her on TV was forced to celebrate this erasure off-screen, actor Ed O'Neill became her fiercest protector. This is the heartbreaking true story of how Hollywood deleted a mother's trauma with a laugh track and the unbreakable bond that saved her. To see exactly how a genuine human tragedy was so brutally sacrificed for a punchline, we have to rewind to the moment this dysfunctional family was born. The television sitcom is fundamentally an engine of American comfort. It is a highly calibrated machine designed to deliver a specific, unyielding promise to the viewing public. No matter how chaotic or unpredictable the real world becomes, the problems inside this illuminated screen will be neatly resolved within 22 minutes, punctuated by the reliable rhythm of a studio laugh track. For decades, the architects of network television understood that the audience tuned in precisely for this safety. But at the dawn of the 1990s, the entertainment landscape was undergoing a violent structural shift. The sanitized, morally pristine families that had dominated the airwaves were losing their grip on a public that was becoming increasingly cynical about the American dream. A new upstart broadcasting network known as Fox recognized this cultural fatigue. To survive and secure its place against the established broadcasting giants, Fox needed a battering ram. They needed a product that shattered the illusion of domestic perfection. They built that battering ram in the form of Married with Children, a program that stripped away the warmth of the traditional family unit and replaced it with a suffocating atmosphere of poverty, mutual resentment, and crude transactional relationships. At the absolute center of this cynical corporate goldmine were two highly trained actors, Ed O'Neill and Katey Sagal. They were tasked with portraying Al and Peggy Bundy, a married couple who essentially functioned as the antithesis of love. Their on-screen existence was defined by a relentless war of verbal attrition, financial despair, and a profound shared regret over their union. To the millions of viewers who tuned in every Sunday night, the Bundy household was a hilarious, liberating mirror of working-class frustration. But behind the cameras, the reality of maintaining this toxic illusion required an immense psychological toll. Actors are not immune to the environments they inhabit for 14 hours a day, operating within a heavily lit soundstage where every line of dialogue is engineered to elicit a mocking laugh, where the entire premise of your character relies on failure and apathy, requires a strict compartmentalization of the human spirit. Katey Sagal, in particular, had to strap herself into the physical and emotional constraints of Peggy Bundy. The teased hair, the restrictive wardrobe, the loud, abrasive persona, while suppressing her own innate warmth and complexity. She was a professional executing a demanding job, generating millions of dollars in advertising revenue for a network that viewed her primarily as a highly effective comedic asset. This carefully maintained boundary between the actor's genuine humanity and the network's cynical product remained intact until the early months of 1991. The strict, predictable formula of the television production schedule was suddenly confronted by an uncontrollable biological variable. Katey Sagal, navigating her late 30s, received the news that she was pregnant with her first child. In the context of normal human existence, this is a milestone of profound, overwhelming joy. It is a period defined by anticipation, a fundamental biological shift where a woman's entire physical architecture begins to prepare for the sustenance of a new life. But inside the highly commodified ecosystem of a Hollywood television studio, a lead actress's pregnancy is rarely viewed through the lens of human empathy. It is immediately classified as a logistical crisis. Historically, the television industry possessed a standard operating procedure for dealing with the inconvenient reality of a pregnant actress. Directors and showrunners, terrified of disrupting the established visual continuity of their programs, would deploy an array of clumsy illusions to hide the growing mother. They would strategically place their lead actresses behind large couches, have them carry oversized laundry baskets, or dress them in heavy, unseasonal winter coats. The underlying message of these tactics was clear. A woman's biological reality was an offensive disruption to the fictional universe, a problem to be visually taped down and hidden from the consumer. However, the executives and writers steering Married with Children did not operate on traditional television logic. They looked at their lead actress. They looked at the impending reality of her physical transformation, and they made a ruthless, highly calculated corporate decision. They did not see a logistical hurdle to be hidden. They saw a massive, unprecedented opportunity for ratings exploitation. The entire premise of their show was built on the misery of the Bundy family. The writers realized that introducing a screaming, demanding, expensive infant into a household that was already buckling under the weight of poverty and mutual hatred was a comedic goldmine. It was the ultimate escalation of the show's core premise. Rather than hiding Sagal's pregnancy, they decided to weaponize it. The network executives gave the directive to write Katey Sagal's actual biological pregnancy directly into the script for the upcoming 6th season. This decision, while seemingly pragmatic from a business standpoint, represented an extraordinary level of corporate hubris. The network was effectively erasing the protective barrier between the actor's real life and the fictional world she inhabited. They were taking the most intimate, vulnerable, and personal milestone of Sagal's life and transforming it into a piece of public property, a plot device designed to be mocked by a live studio audience and consumed by millions of strangers. Furthermore, to maximize the comedic impact, the writers decided to introduce a parallel storyline, declaring that the Bundys' equally dysfunctional neighbor Marcy was also unexpectedly pregnant. The network was building a massive season-long marketing campaign entirely dependent on the successful biological outcome of their lead actress. For the first few months of the production cycle, this audacious gamble appeared to be a brilliant success. As filming for the 6th season commenced, Sagal stepped onto the soundstage carrying the genuine, undeniable physical evidence of her impending motherhood. The atmosphere on the set, usually defined by the required cynicism of the scripts, was temporarily softened by the reality of the situation. The cast and crew, The people who worked alongside her in the trenches of daily television production were genuinely thrilled for her. Sagal was radiant, experiencing the deep hormonal rush of maternal anticipation. She willingly participated in the network's plan, dutifully delivering her lines, allowing the cameras to focus on her growing body, and performing the crude jokes the writers had crafted about her condition. The cognitive dissonance of this period is staggering to consider. Here was a woman experiencing the profound, quiet sanctity of creating human life, yet she was required to process this experience under the blinding glare of studio lights, surrounded by hundreds of laughing spectators, portraying a mother who openly despised her own existence. She was sharing the physical space of her unborn child with the fictional toxicity of Peggy Bundy. The network had successfully commodified her biology. They had placed a price tag on her womb, banking their autumn advertising revenue on the safe delivery of her baby. They were entirely blissfully unaware that by writing human biology into a rigid television script, they were setting the stage for a collision between the artificial control of Hollywood and the brutal, unforgiving unpredictability of nature. The corporate machine had confidently written the first act of the pregnancy, but they had absolutely no power over how the story would end. The daily routine of a television actor is governed by a strict, almost military precision. In the late summer and early autumn of 1991, Katey Sagal's commute to the Fox studio lot in Los Angeles was characterized by a profound dual existence. Every morning she arrived at her dressing room as a woman in her late 30s who was experiencing the deeply personal, quiet miracle of her first pregnancy. And every morning she was strapped into the loud, abrasive, heavily hairsprayed armor of Peggy Bundy. The physical demands of the role were already significant, but performing them while navigating the second and third trimesters of a pregnancy required an immense expenditure of stamina. Sagal had to stand under the blistering heat of the studio lights, maneuver around the bulky television cameras, and deliver rapid-fire comedic dialogue, all while her body was actively diverting massive amounts of energy to grow a human being. On screen, Peggy Bundy complained bitterly about the physical discomfort of carrying a child, slouching on the famous floral couch, demanding that her husband Al fetch her food and massage her feet. The studio audience roared with laughter at her manufactured misery, but beneath the leopard print maternity tops and the cynical punchlines, Sagal was harboring a deep, genuine joy. She was enduring the physical exhaustion because she believed she was moving toward the greatest reward of her life. She was building a future, and she was allowing the network to use the physical evidence of that future to boost their weekly ratings. By October of 1991, Sagal had entered her 7th month. At 28 weeks, a pregnancy transitions into a highly specific biological phase. The abstract concept of a baby becomes an undeniable physical reality. The child is fully formed, capable of movement, responding to sound, and rapidly accumulating the body weight necessary for survival outside the womb. For the mother, the psychological preparation is equally absolute. The nursery at home is prepared. The name is chosen. The mind completely reorients its entire architecture around the impending arrival of this new life. Sagal had named her daughter Ruby. She was operating under the universal protective assumption that because she had safely reached the 3rd trimester, the period of highest risk was firmly behind her. The finish line was in sight, but biology is a ruthless, unpredictable mechanism, completely indifferent to the schedules of Hollywood television networks and the hopes of expectant mothers. There was no cinematic warning. There was no dramatic music to signal that the narrative of her life was about to violently fracture. The medical emergency arrived with terrifying, abrupt speed. The exact medical details of the complication have largely been kept private by Sagal, a rare boundary she managed to maintain in a life otherwise heavily scrutinized by the public. What is known is that the safe, predictable environment of her daily routine was instantly obliterated. The brightly lit sound stages, the script revisions, and the studio audiences vanished, replaced by the sterile, panicked urgency of an emergency room. She was rushed into surgery for an emergency cesarean section. The medical staff operated with desperate speed, executing a major abdominal surgery in a frantic bid to intervene. But the limits of human medicine were reached. The intervention was too late. The baby girl, Ruby, was stillborn. To simply state that a woman lost a baby is a clinical, sanitized reduction of a trauma so profound it fundamentally rewires the human brain. It is a phrase that fails to capture the sheer physical horror of the event. A stillbirth at 7 months is not a miscarriage. It is a full labor and delivery, culminating in absolute devastating silence. It is the arrival of death in the exact room that was prepared for life. When Katey Sagal woke up from the surgical anesthesia, she was forced to confront a reality that the human mind is practically incapable of processing. The psychological devastation was immediate and total, but the cruelty of a late-term stillbirth is that the trauma is not merely emotional, it is intensely, relentlessly physical. The human body does not instantly understand that the child has died. Sagal woke up with a severe burning surgical wound of a major C-section across her abdomen. Her bloodstream was flooded with a massive, chaotic surge of postpartum hormones. Her biology was actively, aggressively preparing to sustain an infant. Her body began the process of lactation, physically demanding to feed a child that she would never hold. Every single biological alarm bell in her system was ringing, searching for a baby that was no longer there. It is a state of profound physical dysmorphia, a biological betrayal that traps a grieving mother in a body that refuses to acknowledge her loss. She was confined to a hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of medical machinery, isolated in an ocean of grief. Just days prior, she had been the center of attention on a bustling comedy set, her growing belly the focal point of a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign. Now, she was entirely alone with the wreckage of her future. The crib she had likely prepared at home was empty. The future she had spent 7 months envisioning had been completely annihilated in a matter of hours. While Katey Sagal lay in a sterile hospital room, physically broken and attempting to survive the initial, suffocating wave of a grief that would alter her forever, a completely different type of crisis was beginning to detonate just a few miles away. The executives at the Fox network, the producers, and the writers of Married with Children received the news of the tragedy. The normal human reaction to such news is immediate, unconditional empathy. But a television network is not a human being. It is a corporate entity, a highly calibrated financial machine designed entirely to generate advertising revenue through the delivery of consistent, scheduled entertainment. When the executives in Los Angeles received the phone call about the stillbirth, they were suddenly forced to look at their spreadsheets, their syndication deals, and their rigid production schedules. They realized with mounting corporate panic that they were facing a catastrophic structural dilemma. They had built an entire season of comedy around a pregnancy that had just ended in a real-world funeral. To comprehend the sheer coldness of the decision that followed, one must understand the absolute unyielding mechanics of a 1990s multi-camera sitcom. The situation comedy is a highly specific, restrictive art form. It relies entirely on a concept known as the status quo reset. Every week, the characters are thrust into a conflict. They navigate that conflict using their established comedic personas. And by the 22nd minute of the broadcast, the universe resets. The characters end the episode in the exact same emotional and physical space where they began. This predictability is what makes the format so comforting to the masses. The audience tunes in because they know the rules of the game will never fundamentally change. Furthermore, Married with Children was not a standard sitcom. It was a show built entirely on the foundation of crude apathy. The humor was derived from the fact that Al and Peggy Bundy did not care about anything, including each other. They were cynical, selfish, and emotionally bulletproof. You physically cannot write the death of an infant into this environment. If the writers had chosen to acknowledge reality, if they had written an episode where Peggy Bundy suffers a stillbirth, they would have permanently destroyed the foundational architecture of the series. The moment a child dies, the characters cease to be comedic caricatures. They become profound, tragic figures. The audience would instantly shift from laughing at them to feeling deep, uncomfortable pity for them. Pity is the absolute death of a cynic-based comedy. If the audience pities Al and Peggy Bundy, they can never laugh at them complaining about shoe sales or burnt dinners ever again. A tragedy of that magnitude would break the machine permanently. The show would be unwatchable. The executives faced a cold logistical calculus. The show was a multi-million-dollar property. Advertisers had already paid a premium for their commercial slots. The syndication contracts, which generated hundreds of millions of dollars in back-end revenue, required a full, uninterrupted season of episodes. The machine could not stop to mourn. The network realized they had to get rid of the pregnancy storyline immediately, but they were structurally forbidden from acknowledging the reality of why. The writer's room was convened. These were individuals whose daily job was to manufacture jokes, now tasked with the grim, surreal assignment of figuring out how to systematically delete a dead child from a fictional universe without alerting the audience to the horror behind the curtain. They could not write a miscarriage. They could not write a sudden adoption. They opted for the most sweeping, absolute form of narrative erasure available in the television medium. They decided to make the entire thing a bad dream. The execution of this decision occurred in episode 11 of the 6th season, titled Al Bundy, Shoe Dick. The writers drafted a script that functioned as an homage to film noir, a stylistic departure that served a very dark, utilitarian purpose. They used the format to write themselves out of the corner. The episode is framed as a long, convoluted detective story, a literal nightmare playing out in the subconscious of Al Bundy. The climax of the episode remains one of the most chilling examples of cognitive dissonance ever broadcast on American television. The camera pans across the familiar trash-strewn living room of the Bundy household. Al Bundy wakes up on his floral couch. He is sweating heavily, breathing hard, visibly shaken by the events of his sleep. He looks around the room, getting his bearings. And then the realization hits him. He realizes that the entire season up to that point, his wife's pregnancy, his neighbor Marcy's pregnancy, the impending financial doom of having another mouth to feed on a shoe salesman's salary, was simply a horrible, prolonged nightmare. None of it actually happened. The execution of the scene is devastating when viewed through the unvarnished lens of reality. Al shouts in absolute, unadulterated joy. He celebrates the fact that his wife is not pregnant. The live studio audience, prompted by the flashing applause signs above the soundstage, screams with laughter and cheers. The sound mixers in the editing bays enhance the audio, layering booming tracks of canned laughter over the scene to ensure the comedic timing landed perfectly. Millions of viewers sitting in their living rooms on a Sunday night laughed along, relieved that the familiar cynical status quo of the Bundy household had been restored. The audience got exactly what they wanted. The problem was solved, and the reset button was successfully pressed. In that exact moment, the television network effectively reduced a mother's devastating real-life tragedy into a triumphant punchline. The child that Katey Sagal had carried for 7 months, the baby girl named Ruby, who had died in a hospital just weeks earlier, was systematically deleted from the public record. The network took the most profound trauma a human being can endure and covered it up entirely with the sound of collective American applause. The corporate problem was solved. The ratings remained high. The advertisers were satisfied. The fictional universe was secure, but the real-world consequences of this narrative erasure were just beginning. While the network was busy broadcasting the punchline to the world, the grieving mother at the center of the tragedy was being forced to confront the harsh legal realities of the entertainment business. The grief of a stillbirth lasts a lifetime, but television production schedules wait for no one. Katey Sagal had been granted a brief, heavily monitored medical leave of absence to physically recover from her emergency abdominal surgery, missing 4 episodes in total. But she was bound by an ironclad, multi-year studio contract. She had no choice. She was legally required to return to work. The stage was set for a psychological torture session masquerading as light entertainment. The network had erased her child on paper, but now they were going to force the mother to physically walk back into the graveyard of her own future, turn on the bright lights, and pretend that nothing had ever happened. The entertainment industry operates on a foundation of ironclad legal agreements. When an actor signs a multi-year contract with a major television network, they effectively surrender their bodily autonomy and their psychological well-being to a production schedule. There is no union provision for the lifelong grief of a stillborn child. There is no corporate mechanism designed to accommodate the shattered psyche of a grieving mother. The Fox network granted Katey Sagal a brief, highly regulated medical leave, just enough time for the physical incision of her emergency cesarean section to begin closing. She missed a total of 4 episodes, but the moment she was physically capable of standing upright, the network demanded her return. The machine was waiting. Place yourself in her shoes for a moment. On the morning she was forced to drive back to the studio lot, the commute through Los Angeles would have been a descent into a psychological nightmare. She had to return to the exact geographical location where she had been celebrated as a mother-to-be. She had to walk past the security gates, through the narrow corridors, and back onto the brightly lit sound stage that had served as the backdrop for her pregnancy. Just weeks prior, she had been happily rubbing her belly between takes, accepting the warm congratulations of the crew. Now the soundstage was a sterile, active crime scene of her erased future. The psychological torture commenced the moment she entered her dressing room. To play Peggy Bundy, Sagal had to undergo a rigorous daily transformation. She sat in the makeup chair and allowed the stylist to tease her hair into the character's massive signature bouffant. She applied the heavy, exaggerated cosmetics. But the most grueling aspect of the transformation was the wardrobe. Sagal was a grieving mother navigating a postpartum body. Her biology was still in a state of traumatic shock, carrying the physical remnants of a terminated pregnancy and a healing surgical wound. Yet, her job explicitly required her to strap herself back into Peggy Bundy's skin-tight spandex pants and restrictive belts. She had to physically compress her traumatized body into the uniform of a cynical comedic caricature. When the stage manager called for places, Sagal had to walk out from behind the heavy studio curtains and face the live audience. This is where the structural cruelty of the television format reached its absolute peak. A multi-camera sitcom is filmed in front of hundreds of tourists and fans sitting in bleachers, suspended in the dark just beyond the camera operators. These people did not know the intimate, horrific details of what Sagal had just survived. They were there for a free comedy show. They wanted to see the lazy housewife and the miserable shoe salesman hurl insults at each other. Sagal had to stand under the blistering heat of the studio lights and perform the active, daily denial of her own trauma. When the director shouted action, she was required to deliver cynical, biting jokes with perfect, comedic timing. She had to project an aura of total apathy, portraying a woman who despised her life but cared about nothing. Every time she delivered a punchline, the studio audience erupted into genuine, roaring laughter. Imagine the profound cognitive dissonance of that environment. She was standing in a room full of people screaming with laughter, while internally she was screaming in agony. She was forced to mask the greatest tragedy of her life beneath a thick layer of mandated, highly lucrative cheerfulness. If she faltered, if her eyes went blank, or if the grief bled through the performance, the scene was ruined. The director would call cut, the momentum would die, and she would be forced to do it again. It was a masterclass in psychological masking, an agonizing daily exercise in self-mutilation required to keep the network's syndication packages on schedule. However, even inside the most ruthless, heavily mechanized corporate factory, human empathy occasionally manages to survive. While the network executives monitored the production from their insulated offices, completely detached from the human cost of their decisions, the people operating on the floor level of that factory could see the devastation. And no one saw it more clearly than the man standing directly across from her in every scene. On screen, Al and Peggy Bundy were the ultimate enemies. Their dynamic was built on a foundation of mutual resentment and verbal warfare. But off-screen, Ed O'Neill recognized the extreme psychological danger his co-star was facing. O'Neill was not a standard Hollywood actor. He was a former steel mill worker from Ohio, a grounded, highly perceptive man who understood the fundamental difference between human reality and corporate fiction. He looked at Sagal, and he saw a woman operating on the absolute edge of a psychological collapse, forced to march through a comedic minefield by producers who only cared about the shooting schedule. O'Neill understood the specific vulnerability of her position. In television production, the lead actor holds a massive amount of unwritten structural power. If the star stops moving, the entire multi-million-dollar apparatus grinds to a halt. O'Neill decided to weaponize his leverage as the patriarch of the show to protect the grieving mother standing next to him. He stepped into the breach, acting as a physical and emotional shield. When aggressive network directors pushed for faster turnaround times between takes, or when producers demanded more manic energy from Sagal, O'Neill intervened. He used his substantial clout to guard her perimeter. He watched her constantly during the grueling multi-hour taping sessions. If he sensed her breathing change, if he noticed her eyes losing focus, or if he felt she was becoming overwhelmed by the suffocating atmosphere of the set, he did not wait for her to ask for help. He would deliberately sabotage the take. He would forget a line, intentionally miss a mark, or simply call a halt to the production, loudly demanding a break for himself. He absorbed the frustration of the directors, so she did not have to. He forced the relentless machine to pause, creating silent, vital pockets of oxygen for Sagal to step off the stage, retreat to the shadows, and collect herself. He stood physically between her and the machinery of the network. He did not offer empty platitudes or attempt to fix a grief that was unfixable. He offered the most valuable commodity in Hollywood, unconditional protective solidarity. O'Neill's actions during this period are a profound testament to humanity operating within a capitalist void. He could not bring her daughter back. He could not change the cruel, cynical reality of the scripts they were forced to perform, but he ensured that she did not have to face the darkness of that soundstage alone. He proved that even when an industry systematically attempts to strip a worker of their dignity and their right to mourn, the people in the trenches can still choose to protect their own. His empathy served as a vital anchor, keeping Sagal tethered to reality while the network forced her to inhabit a bad dream. The passage of time is a ruthless, indifferent mechanism. It does not pause to accommodate the shattered psyche of a grieving parent. For Katey Sagal, surviving the immediate aftermath of 1991 required a daily, grueling compartmentalization. She had successfully navigated the rest of the 6th season of Married You with children, fulfilling her contractual obligations, standing under the bright studio lights and delivering the cynical punchlines required to keep the Fox network's flagship comedy afloat. When the camera stopped rolling and the studio audiences finally went home, she retreated into her private life, undertaking the slow, agonizing process of psychological reconstruction. The trauma of a late-term stillbirth does not simply fade. It permanently alters the biological and emotional architecture of the mother. When Sagal eventually found the immense courage to try to build her family again, the experience was entirely stripped of the carefree joy that characterizes a standard pregnancy. Expecting a child after a stillbirth is a terrifying psychological endurance test. Every single day is defined by a heavy, suffocating anxiety, a hypervigilance rooted in the brutal knowledge that biology makes no promises, and that the absolute worst-case scenario is not just a statistical possibility, but a reality she had already lived. Sagal would eventually become pregnant twice more during the 11-season run of the series, successfully and joyfully giving birth to 2 healthy children. However, while Sagal found personal healing, the corporate machinery surrounding her had also been permanently altered by the tragedy of 1991, when the network executives and the showrunners received the news of her subsequent pregnancies. Their reaction was the polar opposite of their behavior during season 6. There was no boardroom excitement. There were no calculated meetings about how to leverage her growing body for a ratings sweeps week. The executives had peered into the abyss of real-world trauma, and they were terrified of what they had seen. The industry of television production is notoriously superstitious, driven by a desperate need to control every variable on a soundstage. The producers had survived the logistical and public relations nightmare of having to erase a dead infant from their continuity, and they were absolutely, categorically unwilling to ever risk putting themselves or their lead actress through that horrific ordeal a second time. A strict, unyielding directive was handed down from the top of the production hierarchy. The real-life biology of Katey Sagal would never again intersect with the fictional universe of Peggy Bundy. The writers flatly refused to write her subsequent pregnancies into the script. This corporate embargo on reality forced the production to resort to the most absurd, transparent visual camouflage available in the television medium. During her later pregnancies, as her physical body naturally expanded, the directors went to ridiculous, almost comical lengths to hide her from the camera lens. The audience was treated to bizarre staging choices. Peggy Bundy, a character famously known for doing absolutely zero domestic labor, was suddenly filmed standing behind massive, inexplicably placed laundry baskets. She was strategically seated behind high-backed couches or filmed exclusively from the chest up. When Sagal grew too heavily pregnant to be hidden by furniture or props, the writers simply exiled her from the narrative entirely. They would write Peggy out of the script for weeks at a time, explaining her absence with flimsy, nonsensical excuses. They claimed Peggy had traveled back to her fictional hometown of Wanker County, or that she was off traveling the country on an extended off-screen bus tour. To the casual viewer sitting at home, these visual tricks and sudden absences were just odd, slightly jarring sitcom tropes. They looked completely ridiculous on screen. But those massive laundry baskets, the awkwardly placed furniture, and the sudden bus tours were not comedic choices. They were the silent visual scars of a tragedy the production had barely survived. The directors actively chose to compromise the visual integrity of their multi-million-dollar comedy, rather than risk merging human biology with their corporate script ever again. It was a physical manifestation of the trauma that had permanently infected the soundstage. When we examine the broader history of American television, the situation comedy is explicitly designed to function as an anesthetic. It is manufactured, packaged, and broadcast to deliver reliable, uncomplicated comfort to millions of living rooms across the world. The working class consumes these 22-minute episodes precisely because the consequences are low. The problems are neatly solved before the final commercial break, and the characters remain happily, safely frozen in time. We watch them to escape the heavy, unpredictable burdens of our own lives. But the story of Katey Sagal tears down the brightly painted facade of that escape. It exposes the ruthless, invisible toll exacted on the human beings who are contractually obligated to provide that comfort. The Hollywood machine demands absolute, total dedication to the product, and it is entirely indifferent to human suffering. The network executives view their actors not as people, but as highly paid, highly disposable components in an advertising delivery system. Katey Sagal demonstrated a level of psychological resilience that defies simple categorization. She survived the catastrophic failure of her own biology, the loss of her daughter, and the brutal indifference of her employer. She continued to anchor one of the most successful comedies in the history of broadcasting, maintaining the illusion of a toxic, lazy housewife while quietly carrying the heaviest grief a human being can shoulder. Her legacy is not merely the laughter she generated. It is a stark, unvarnished indictment of the entertainment industry. It is a permanent reminder that the business of manufacturing joy is frequently devoid of humanity. To ensure the American public could forget their troubles and laugh on a Sunday night, a mother was forced to bury her child in silence. She was forced to walk back onto a brightly lit stage, strap on a costume, and pretend to the entire world that the greatest, most devastating tragedy of her life was nothing more than a funny bad dream. We demand that our entertainers make us smile. We consume their labor ravenously, and we rarely stop to consider the absolute devastation they might be hiding just behind the punchline.